All right, everybody. So today's class is a transition into our new module, which is oriented around anthropology, sport, and spectacle. So in our last section, we focused on biological anthropology and its various intersections with race. As part of our new module, I want to focus on the development, particularly of archaeology as a subdiscipline within anthropology, looking particularly at American archaeology. Now, in the development of American archaeology, monumental earthenwork mounds were a key facet of initial kind of interest in the study of the North American past. So today I want to kind of orient our discussion about the development of American archaeology around this question of the mound and the mound builders in North America. But before we get into the mound builders themselves, I just want to give a little context about how people are kind of thinking about the past and archaeology at this time. So the earliest evidence that we have that people were making a kind of conceptual distinction between the past and the present comes from Europe during the Renaissance era. So think roughly 14th to 16th centuries. A key figure during this time was a poet and linguist named Petrarch. So Petrarch viewed classical Rome and Greece as the absolute pinnacle of human, social, and cultural developments. So this should sound pretty similar to other kind of rhetorics that we've talked about in the last section by Morgan and Spencer and others, who really viewed the kind of antecedents of European civilization in the 18th and 19th centuries as being the kind of pinnacle of civilization. So Petrarch rediscovered and studied classical texts and objects that had largely been ignored during the medieval period in Europe, where much more of the scholarly interest was focused on the Bible and developing kind of theories around the biblical origins of modern European society. Thanks to people like Petrarch, who popularized and really glamorized classical antiquity, by the 1700s, there was a growing number of Europeans in the leisure class who considered an interest in classical antiquities to be a key facet of cultivating good taste. This group of amateur collectors of antiquities are referred to as antiquarians. Antiquarians are people who studied antiquities largely for the sake of the objects themselves, and weren't really particularly concerned about understanding people or the cultures that produced these objects. Antiquarians were largely unscientific in their approach, and instead of answering questions about the past, they were interested in filling up their curio cabinets with art objects and recording and preserving national architectural treasures like Trajan's Triumphal Arch in Italy. So I'm kind of curious to start our conversation off by hearing from you guys. What archaeological discoveries have shaped your ideas about the past? So take a moment if you're watching this to write down some ideas about how archaeology has shaped your ideas about the past. So the origins of American archaeology are intimately tied to the exploration and colonization of North America during this period of really informal archaeological research. So this is during this kind of antiquarian period where people were very interested in objects and not necessarily in the kind of scientific study of past societies. So early colonists who were coming to the Americas encountered all sorts of material evidence of native life. So petroglyphs, pictographs, and all sorts of stone tools and ceramics that were being kind of brought up as settlers broke ground in North America. In the southeast and northeast in particular, settlers encountered these large earthenwork mounds, which spurred several centuries of curiosity, study, and debate regarding their origins, their antiquity, and what they were actually used for. Hernando de Soto made the first recorded descriptions of these mounds along the eastern seaboard and the indigenous people who built these mounds in the lower Mississippi Valley during the Spanish entrada into La Florida. So at this time, La Florida included present-day Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, as well as the Carolinas. And these areas were the traditional territories of the Natchez, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Cherokee people, as well as other smaller groups. In 1539, De Soto and a company of some about 1,000 adventurers arrived in what became La Florida, and for the next 3 years explored the interior in search of rumored gold and silver. The accounts that De Soto wrote from this exploration contained the most detailed descriptions of indigenous villages and mounds really to date, and it's particularly prior to the 18th century. So the first kind of encounters with similar prehistoric mounds in the Ohio Valley came during Anglo-American settlement. So particularly an Anglo-American traveler by the name of Dr. Thomas Walker documented the appearance of these mounds or the presence of these mounds outside of the Southeast. Now, Dr. Thomas Walker was a founding member of what was called the Loyal Land Company of Virginia. And in the spring of 1750, under the direction of Walker, they undertook a survey of 800,000 acres of royal land grant in Kentucky in preparation for settlement. Near the mouth of the Columbia River, Walker's party came across the remains of several households surrounded by a large earthen enclosure. Given the proximity of the earthen mounds to known trade routes and sites, it's likely that other European settlers had encountered these types of earthenworks as well, but simply had recorded it in less kind of formal ways than more literary minded explorers like Walker and De Soto, who recorded it in their diaries and journals. The ultimate aim of many of these early kind of exploratory accounts was to return home and write a work of literary merit based on your adventures abroad. One of these kind of adventurers / literary scholars was James Adar, an Irish-American deerskin trader who gave further notice of the mounds which he located in the region. In a famous work called The History of the American Indians, which was published in London in 1775. So during his explorations of North America, Adar remarked on the grand scale of the mounds and enclosures he encountered, which he referred to as fortresses. Adar, who lived in the Southeast for about 40 years, argued that American Indians were actually descendants from ancient Hebrews who had been descended from, again, think back to our previous lectures, from Noah's son Ham, who had been kind of sent out of Israel, or the promised land where Noah's Ark landed. So Adar connects Native people specifically to a Christian tradition, and which draws into question the kind of racial and ethnic differences between Native peoples and Europeans. In 1787, Benjamin Smith Barton published a book which proposed that the mounds had been built actually by the Danes, who then migrated to Mexico and became the Toltecs. In later works, he didn't pursue this idea, but instead he argued that Indians had migrated from Asia sometime prior to about 4000 BC. This date, 4004 BC, was a theologically accepted date given by Archbishop Usher for the creation of the universe. So this opinion by Benjamin Smith Barton was one of the first attempts to give a real time depth to the pre-European history in the Americas. So far more significant than Adar or Smith's writings were the accounts of the mounds that occurred at the end of the 18th century. Although incidental and impressionistic, these accounts embodied the leading questions regarding the origins of the mounds, which defined discourse in America until the end of the 19th century. For instance, the Moravian missionary David Zeisberger described a prehistoric earthenwork that he and a group of Delaware Indians had identified near the Schönbrunn Mission on the Tuscarora River in 1772. So Zeisberg's account of these mounds is significant for two reasons. Here's an excerpt of his account. So his description of the earthworks as fortifications mirrors what Adar's interpretation was and represents an early and widespread assumption among observers that these were military forts. So while some of these enclosures were actually stockaded village sites, the more elaborate geometric works actually served a religious and ceremonial purpose, as well as other purposes linked to kind of astronomical and calendrical determinations of seasonality and ceremonies. Zeisberg's account also attributes the mounds to an earlier group of native peoples, as opposed to those native peoples who were residing in the Ohio Valley at the time he was writing. Many other observers also attributed the remains of mounds to earlier mysterious groups of native people. This kind of temporal distinction is important because it denied a connection between living native communities that settlers were encountering and earlier residents of the continent. From the pens of these travelers and scholars came the myth of the mound builders. So Robert Silverberg has traced the beginnings of this kind of mythology around the mound builders as far back as 1785, but its real heyday was the 1800s. In brief, the myth held that the multitude of mounds and ruins which were constantly being discovered in Ohio and other frontier areas as colonists pushed west could not have possibly been built by the native people who were residing in these areas. Instead, they must have been built by a civilized race that had disappeared a long time ago. Now, whether that civilized race was another Native American group, or whether it was a group with European ancestry was up for debate. There's two reasons why this myth became so central to early American scholars. First, the idea of a lost kind of prehistoric race was profoundly satisfying for settlers looking to understand and historicize their new home. And if those early inhabitants were white men or Israelites, all the better, because it fit within a Christian tradition. Another key reason for the resiliency of this myth of the mound builders was that Native Americans were believed to be savages incapable of building the mounds. So unlike in Central and Latin America, where the Spanish encountered these kind of massive architectural works built by the Inca and Aztec, the English colonists saw native people as these kind of warlike, degenerate savages who occupied the land that new settlers wanted to use and own. And framing these kind of the current native people as kind of savages incapable of building these impressive monumental works really justified the colonial conquest of the lands by European settlers. So Thomas Jefferson's exploration of one of these mounds along the Rivanna River in central Virginia significantly influenced early archaeological thought in America. In Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, Jefferson describes the indigenous communities of the colony based on his excavations. Archaeologists have since dated the mound that Jefferson looked into to about 900 to 1700 AD. Driven by curiosity, Jefferson wanted to understand the internal structure and content of the mounds, and his approach to excavation anticipates the fundamental approach and methods of modern archaeology by about 100 years. So in order to begin this kind of systematic excavation, what Jefferson did was to create a trench through the mound so that he could actually see the profile of the mound itself. And therefore he could recognize what we call stratigraphy, or differences in soil and artifact composition horizontally, right? Which is through time. So what he discovered was there was a skeletal material that had been placed in the mound and then covered, and that this process had been repeated many times so that the mound had eventually reached 12 feet in height. Jefferson estimates that the mound contained about 1,000 skeletons. He also noted that these were the bodies of men, women, and children, which really shed doubt on the belief that these mounds may have been fortresses associated with battles or warriors. While Jefferson doesn't say who assisted him in the exploration of the Rivanna River mounds, it was likely the slaves at Monticello who provided the labor under his supervision. And that's an important note here to recognize that the kind of intersections here between Jefferson's position as a white Euro-American settler, native people whose history Jefferson was trying to understand, and chattel slaves who were being employed by Jefferson to help uncover that history. And this is what scholars have referred to as the settler-colonial triad. The triad includes that relationship between white settlers, black chattel slaves, and indigenous peoples. So the builders of the mounds and earthworks were actually sedentary agricultural people, but Jefferson and many other Euro-Americans during this time insisted upon seeing indigenous people as nomadic. This kind of faulty assumption explains why Jefferson believed that building this kind of monumental architecture required a higher degree of development than was capable of people living in a kind of nomadic hunter-gatherer state. The key questions that arose out of Jefferson's work were: who built the mounds? Were they military or religious in purpose? And how old were they? So while Jefferson may have set the stage for scientific archaeology, it was really only after the American Revolution, when indigenous land claims northwest of the Ohio River Valley had been kind of fully eradicated, that archaeological study of the mounds commenced in earnest. There's three kind of big things that we can take away from Jefferson's excavations. First is the idea that Jefferson was the first kind of amateur archaeologist to actually engage in kind of systematic research. And this is an important step that few scholars were taking during this time. Remember, this is the era of antiquarianism, where people are just interested in collecting objects, not necessarily in being systematic about their research. A second big thing about Jefferson's work is that his excavations were sufficiently careful to allow him to observe the nature of stratigraphy in his trenches and thus to relatively date deposits. Relative dating involves placing objects in chronological order using their relationship to one another. Stratigraphy is one of the main ways of doing this type of dating during archaeological excavations. The basic idea of stratigraphy is that the deeper stuff is older unless the site has been disturbed. So by documenting changes in artifacts over time, you can actually assess how long a site has been occupied. Finally, Jefferson is important to consider here because the excavations were done not to find objects, but to resolve archaeological problems. So Jefferson really became the first president of the American Philosophical Society, which became a central contributor to publications of anthropological papers and the collection of archaeological objects. In 1799, Jefferson sent a letter to members of the American Philosophical Society regarding the collection of archaeological data. In this letter, he lays out the specific criteria on how and what to collect in terms of data at archaeological sites, including things like measuring masonry, descriptions of stones, and measurements of tree ring diameters. The American Philosophical Society was not alone at this time in its efforts to encourage the collection and publication of a more systematic form of archaeological data. In 1812, Isaiah Thomas founded the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts. The American Antiquarian Society was the first of its kind in the Americas and reflected a kind of growing public interest in the history of North America. The work of other scholars like Caleb Atwater appeared in the first volumes of the AAS Journal in 1820. And Atwater was particularly interested in understanding the antiquities discovered in the Ohio River Valley in association with these mounds. So Atwater particularly explored mounds near his home in Circleville, Ohio, and provided the best descriptions and planned drawing of the mounds that had yet to be made. So some consider Atwater to be the first true archaeologist. In his descriptions, Atwater used a three-part classification scheme that differentiated the archaeological remains of modern Europeans from modern Native Americans, as well as from mound builders. In his highly speculative work, he proposed that Hindus had migrated from India and later moved to Mexico, and that these are the people who had built the mounds. A proposal that sounds very similar to what Barton Smith had said. As we know, Atwater's ideas were incorrect. By the beginning of the 19th century, two basic positions had emerged regarding the origins of the mounds. Either the mound builders and indigenous people of the continent were one and the same, or the mound builders were an ancient race who had died off or moved away or been replaced by later indigenous groups. No links could really be seen between contemporary Native people and the mounds by most observers of the time, despite early accounts like De Soto, which actually showed Native people building and using mounds in the southeast. Instead, various speculative origins for the mounds were proposed and debated hotly. For instance, Amos Stoddard hypothesized that Welshmen were actually the great mound builders. And H. Breckenridge asserted that the mound builders were Toltecs who had migrated south to Mexico. In addition to these kind of questions about who built the mounds was the issue of dates. The the Reverend Coulter explored mounds in Marietta, Ohio, and attempted to date them by counting the number of rings on trees that had grown on top of them. Coulter's efforts are one of the earliest attempts at absolute dating in the Americas, and tree ring dating has since become the most accurate and precise means of dating archaeological materials. As the mound builder debate escalated, the general public was caught up in arguments around a lost race. The idea of the lost race received a blow in 1839 when our old friend S.G. Morton published Crania Americana. Morton concluded that there was just one race represented in his sample of skulls, which he had collected from mounds as well as recently deceased individuals. So while it was clear that the mound builders were not in fact a different race, the debate still raged about who these early inhabitants were. This myth of the mound builders was not debunked until 1894, when Cyrus Thomas provided a comprehensive report to the Bureau of Ethnology on the mounds. So I'm curious to hear from the class, in what ways do you think this kind of mound builder myth has harmed contemporary Native peoples? Or do you think this is kind of a harmless narrative that really doesn't have an impact on people today? So to wrap up here, as of 1840, American archaeology as a scholarly kind of discipline simply didn't exist. There was no full-time practitioners or professors. There were no real field methods, and chronological knowledge was pretty rudimentary at best. It was generally accepted that the New World was peopled from Asia via the Bering Strait, but beyond that, there was little agreement or knowledge about the origins or migrations of early Native people. Nevertheless, there was a beginning. The steps of gathering data had been presented by the American Philosophical Society in its 1779 letter, and a model of how to investigate archaeological problems was presented in the excavations of Thomas Jefferson. The framework of archaeological survey can also be seen in Atwater's Ohio Mound Studies. All of these trends led to the birth of the discipline of American archaeology in the second half of the 19th century. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll see you next week.